Alright, so greetings from Pennsylvania, and we have made it to the Fort Necessity National Battlefield. And of course, this is still part of my Western PA trip here at the end of May. Today is May 25th. Filmed a number of places yesterday, and we just filmed Juman Glen, where the French and Indian War started. Now we're here at Fort Necessity National Battlefield. So I've already stopped at the visitor center, got myself a new hat. The blue one was getting a little ratty looking, and it doesn't do so well in the hot sun. That dark blue kind of soaks up the sun a lot more, so a lighter color will help. But get some nice hats in there. It helps to support what goes on here too when you stop in and get stuff at the visitor center. All right, but we're gonna walk out to where the fort site is, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened here. This is the location where, after that little skirmish at Jumonville Glen, this is where George Washington retreated to, and he built a fort here called Fort Necessity. He didn't stay here too long. He ended up having to surrender to the superior French forces at one point. But we'll talk about that. But let's get back to where the fort site is located. Yes, once again, there is the visitor center. Got some cool stuff in there you can buy, and the trail back to the fort goes back around that way. So it's out back behind the visitor center. So that's where we're gonna head, check things out. Alright, so I do have a map here, because we're right here at the visitor center. Looks like a 0.2 mile hike to where the fort is located. Because there's a cool spot up here called Mount Washington Tavern, but that place is currently closed. But it looks like a cool building, but maybe I'll film that sometime in the future when it opens back up. Well, they have a location where the French camp was, and a trace of Braddock Road. We'll talk more about Braddock's Road in a future video though. So let's head up to the location of the fort. Just a 0.2 mile walk. Yeah, so after Washington's skirmish with the French at Jumonville Glen, one of the French soldiers escaped and made it back to Fort Duquesne. And Washington knew that there would be French retaliation for what happened. So they retreated, because that battle occurred on May 28th of 1754, or close to there. But then, of course, he retreated back to this spot here that was often called the Great Meadows. Of course, they had camped here prior to the skirmish at the Glen. I guess it's called a Great Meadows, so I guess there was lots of nice meadows here, made a nice little camp spot. So after that skirmish, they retreated back here, and he began building a fort because he knew the French would come. You know, they weren't going to let that skirmish go. And come they did, with a pretty large force. 500 French soldiers and 100 Indians, so 600 people altogether, and Washington did not have the forces to withstand that kind of attack. Plus, it was like soaking rain that day. All the guns were soaked. The old muskets needed gunpowder and a flame, spark to fire them, and it was a disaster. They do a nice little trail out here. They are out mowing the lawn too, so we have to deal with some lawnmower noise, but it is what it is. Yeah, I think up there is the location of the fort, or a reproduction of it. Alright, so I didn't pick the greatest day to come here and film. They're busy mowing out there, which is good. I mean, it's what they need to do. They're doing their job. I'm not complaining. But out there is a reproduction of the fort. And back here where I'm standing is roughly where the French and the Indian forces stood, firing on the fort. But we'll find a little bit of a quieter spot to talk about what happened. A little bit later I will stop in, kind of check out the reproduction they have there. So they do have a number of hiking trails here too, if you just want to come and do some hiking. I just want to get a little bit further away from that noise. So yeah, the fort is called Fort Necessity because it was built out of necessity. They needed a place, to put up a defense. And the plaques back there said that the French had 700 men altogether in their forces. And after that battle in the Glen, Washington only had, there's only about 40 of his men at that skirmish, but he had about 100 altogether or so. But more joined him, so he had about 400 men there at that fort. But still, 400 to 700 just wasn't the best odds, even inside the fort. Because like I said, later that day, just a rainstorm came. They had built trenches around the fort, but the trenches just filled with water. The men were just sitting in water, and it was just awful. Did not go well for them. So the British thought they were pretty much doomed at that point. They thought that the French were preparing for a front on attack. And they just didn't have the manpower, the gunpowder, or the bayonets to put up a defense. So they were expecting the worst. Then all of a sudden they heard some shouting. They thought, oh, here comes the attack. But it was just, the shouting was just trying to get the attention of the British, because the French had decided to negotiate a surrender with them. Oh yeah, here's part of the Braddock Road. Like I said, we'll talk about that a lot more in a future video, but it was built by General Braddock. Well, parts of it were built by Washington in 1754, but it was later widened by Braddock. Some interesting history to it. It was built to take British forces to the Pittsburgh area. Historic Braddock Road. Yeah, there's another place just down the road that I'm headed to called Braddock's Grave, where General Braddock is buried. That deals more with history a year later in 1755, although it's directly linked to what happened here. It was the British, I guess you could say, retaliation to what occurred here, or the British offensive to try and take back control of the area after what happened at Fort Necessity. This old road has a lot of history to it. When you walk on this road, you're walking into the past. Braddock's, it was the largest army at the time in 1755 that came down this road. 2,400 men through the wilderness. All right, but let's get back to, we need to go back a year earlier, back to 1754 again, talk about what happened here at the fort. So yeah, things could have gone really bad for the British and Washington. I think there were some of his Virginia militia with him there too, but the French offered negotiations to surrender, and Washington took him up. He realized he was not in a position to defend the fort anymore. It was just, the fort was hastily built. It was built out of necessity, remember? So there were some flaws in the design and things that he didn't realize till later. Yeah, because the tree line, they had cut down the trees from around the fort, but what they didn't realize is that, yeah, the tree line was still close enough for the French to shoot in, and it offered them cover. You couldn't really see them from the fort, so it was just everything about it just didn't really work out so well. But they were, in the terms of surrender, they were allowed to leave the fort on their own free will. But history could have been a lot different here. If the French hadn't offered terms of surrender, and they didn't have to, I mean, if they wanted to, they could have probably just totally annihilated this British force here, including George Washington. So if things had occurred differently, there would be no George Washington in later years, no President of the United States, things like that. So it's just interesting how just one little turn of events in history could have changed things. Also, if you remember at the battle, Jumonville Glen in the earlier video, the commander of the French forces was, his last name was Jumonville, but his half-brother led the French forces here at this battle. So that was kind of interesting. So he was the guy leading the negotiations of surrender. And interestingly enough, I think we talked about it in that video, the terms of surrender included an admission of guilt upon Washington's part that he had assassinated the guy's half-brother Jumonville at that skirmish. But like we said, Washington didn't speak French. It was not his language, so history thinks maybe he didn't really know what he was signing, that was in there. If that makes sense. That he didn't really know what he was signing, that he was just signing terms of surrender. But within the terms of surrender was getting him to admit that he assassinated the commander of the French forces in that battle at the Glen. So whether or not Washington knew exactly what he was signing in those terms of surrender, that it included that extra part about the dude's half-brother being assassinated at the earlier skirmish, we'll never really know. But Washington, he had to do what he had to do to get the rest of his men out of here, because it was just a bad situation. Alright, so that is the Battle of Fort Necessity. Like I said, it's interesting. It was not a huge battle. It didn't, just last that day. It happened on July 3rd of 1754, and then the next day, July 4th, Washington retreated from the fort. Kind of interesting, July 4th. It meant something a little bit different back then. Yeah, so nowadays, this old road is just a trail that people walk along, but back then, this was so much more. Yeah, it's just interesting. You just walk along here. Like back when we were at Jumonville Glen, you know, just standing in the glen, just trying to picture what it was like back then. I mean, today it's so peaceful. Same with this trail. Now it's just a nice little trail through the woods, because that takes you back to the fort. But back in the day, this was the happening place. And the irony of it is, you know, George Washington is one who initially kind of built this road. Braddock is one who widened it in 1755. But the French and forces used this road then to attack Washington at Fort Necessity. So they kind of used the very road that he had worked on. A little bit of irony there. All right, let's get back to the fort. It's gonna be a little bit noisy with the mowing, but let's go check out the reproduction there. Yeah, they also have a number of plaques and information boards explaining a lot of what I just said, but didn't really want to show them here just because of the noise. All right, let's head up, check out the fort. Actually, I'm just gonna wait for them to finish. It looks like they're almost done. So maybe we'll just chill out here for a little bit. Walk up there a little bit later. All right, so they are mostly done, but they're done up here, so let's check it out. Please stay off the earthworks. So I'm not sure if these are the original earthworks or reproductions, but you can see where the trenches were. These are the trenches that were filled with water after they dug them, and it was pretty awful for the troops. It's a fort. Fort looks a little small for 400 men. But it has that typical shape for these forts. And the French arrived from that location, because up there was Braddock's Road. Like I said, they used that road to get here. Of course, it wasn't called Braddock's Road at the time. It was referred to, it was the road that Washington had built earlier. One of those swivel cannons. Of course, that was one of the terms of surrender too. Washington had to give up his swivel cannons. Yes, this is what they were mowing up here earlier. It's locked. We can't get in. All right. Let's just look inside there. Maybe we can get a peek in from somewhere else. But still, this gives you an idea of what it would look. You know, they would have hastily cut down some of these trees and made a palisade. Actually, can we see? I can pop the camera up in there for you guys a little bit. I'm not sure if there's anything in there or not. Can't really tell. Yeah, pop my head in there. It looks like there's a few things in there that they use for, maybe they have like little reenactments out here or something like that. It's a pretty cool site here though. I love the old log construction though. Of course, this is a reproduction too. You know, but they built it in a way to look kind of like what it would look like back then. They even have like bark roofing. That's cool. All right. Yeah, and after Washington surrendered and left, the French just burned this place down. They had no need for it. So I guess that'll be it for Fort Necessity battlefield here. Like I say, it wasn't a huge battle that was fought here, but it's still a piece of history, an important piece of history. And as I mentioned earlier, if events had occurred differently here, our own nation's history, you know, later the United States would have been much different. You know, George Washington wouldn't have been around. Like I said, the British had never offered terms of surrender. He most likely would have been killed here. I mean, you never know. Sometimes in these battles, the officers were spared, but you never know. History could turn out much different than what it did. That's the way history always is. You know, just one little difference or one little turn of events could change the whole scope of things. That's what makes history interesting sometimes, to think about what could have been or what might have been. All right, but we are done here. Because I'm not done with my trip. I gotta find a place to eat lunch, and then we're gonna do some hiking down at Ohiopyle State Park. All right, as always, thanks for coming along. and I hope to see you in the next video.